Thank you all for joining us today. We're here to share about Gift Asia's new initiative called DisasterLink. We're really excited to share just how this program came to be and a little bit about how it works. First, just to introduce the people that will be speaking today, I'm Sheena Agarwal. I'm the VP of Operations at Gift Asia, and I'm joined by Alex, who's our Director of Corporate Partnerships. And Alex and I are going to be tag teaming the presentation. We're going to go through a little bit about Gift Asia, who we are, our disaster program, and some track record there in the region, as well as why we set up DisasterLink and how it works. And with that, I'll hand it to Alex.
Thanks, Sheena. So let me just start this off by explaining a little bit about Gift Asia. We are a philanthropic intermediary and a nonprofit organization. So we connect donors, whether they be corporate, individuals, families, or private foundations, to charities across Asia. Our entire mission revolves around making this process easier for both charities and donors. And so with that, we have a couple of core services that we do regularly employ. We conduct donor advice giving. So we work with donors to facilitate their grant making in over 23 markets in Asia. We also fiscally sponsor US bank accounts for Asia-based charities who may not otherwise have the ability to fundraise or the registration to collect funds in the United States. We do this in the Hong Kong region and Australia as well. We also partner with corporations and provide tailored services to address any specific needs outside of grant making they may have, and we will be talking about our disaster response funds today. With that said, the Asia Pacific region is home to over 2/3 of natural disasters globally. And so I think we can confidently say that we've been giving to global disasters for a while. So we've responded to 40 disaster events in the last 15 years. And because of that, we have a dedicated disaster team. And this is specifically because Asia is exponentially more likely to suffer from a natural disaster than other regions. Since the beginning, we've always sort of placed a priority on funding the full cycle of a disaster. So this means staying in the communities that our partners work in as they seek to recover and rebuild from a disaster. So it's not necessarily about focusing on the most acute phase immediately afterwards, but staying with these local entities who know their communities and stay in these communities for years. Any funding that we give these local partners are informed by their disaster context for decades. So we wanted to provide a little bit of a snapshot of the kind of emergency situations we work in. So we've raised over $27 million for COVID response, but we also have a special niche in working in natural disasters given our region. So we do both response and recovery efforts, as well as capacity building. We've included a small list of disasters we've responded to in the last couple of years, which include the Australian bushfire crisis, the Taal volcano recovery, and then we talk a little bit about our disaster resilient community support, so disaster preparedness and climate mitigation efforts. In terms of who we work with, as of 2020, we pulled the numbers and we funded over 293 organizations. And so we've done so with the support of over 60 corporate donors and literal hundreds of passionate individuals or private funders. So we've included a small example of the corporations who've publicly acknowledged, either through press releases or quotes on our website, their funding with us and their partnership with us, just to give you an example. One of the fun facts that we included here is that in 2020, over 79% of our disaster giving supported local organizations, and that number has only grown. So with all of that experience in history and disaster giving, we started to notice some recurring challenges when it came to delivering funding for disasters. And when we talked to either donors or NGOs, we'd hear recurring frustrations. And sometimes the gaps are easiest to identify when you're actively working on the issues. And so because of that, we continued our disaster grant making, and we started keeping track of where we kept hearing these complaints or frustrations or challenges. On the donor side, it generally broke down into 3 categories. The first one was time. The length of time that it took to vet some of these organizations' source proposals was significant. And this was compounded during disasters where NGO operations are often affected, which made information flow to the donors less than rapid. And some of our donors as well faced a lot of internal challenges. So they may have their own approval processes, compliance teams, which especially for new or more local organizations were really lengthy. And finally, it's hard to invest in it takes some upfront investment to find these local partners who really have the best reputations or greatest impact. And before a disaster happens, it's not necessarily easy to justify that investment. And so because of that, when a disaster occurs, the donor may not know immediately who to turn to. Trust was also a very Asia-specific challenge that we encountered in certain areas or regions in Asia. There are understandably low rates of donor confidence, and this is due to a variety of reasons, from corruption, still building up regulations in the charitable sector, but this was a massive hurdle to overcome when donors are deciding who they want to give to in a disaster scenario. Additionally, in a corporate setting, there is a difference between NGO familiarity and trust from an HQ to a country level. So corporate donations during disasters, for example, are often informed by employees when deciding where to give. And because of that, employees want to give to organizations where they know are trusted, have that local name recognition, but those donations require HQ buy-in, often from employee matching events. And that generates some of the internal vetting challenges that we talked about a little bit earlier. And then finally, the third category in which we kept hearing donor challenges was transparency. So even when general operating support or funding is given, donors want to know who they're funding. And so because of that, they want to understand how these organizations are responding, how it's going, and there is a certain emotional tie to a lot of the disasters that occur. We also had some NGO complaints or frustrations or challenges. And I think one of the primary ones that we faced was the time resource prioritization issue. And so NGOs spoke at length about the limited bandwidth that they have during a disaster to, one, address specific donor requests, two, fill out these very specific tailored proposals that come from a specific donor during a disaster context. And so often it forced a hard choice between using staff time for admin versus more urgent program needs while a disaster and crisis was ongoing. And additionally, even when they did get funding, if it was restricted, it sometimes prevented NGOs from addressing emerging needs that maybe weren't anticipated a little bit earlier. So if, for example, restricted funding was given that was no longer relevant to the context, what would happen would be that it would take additional staff time for the staff to pivot, request reallocations for the funding, wait for donor response during times when a lot of this programming was most time sensitive. And so we also, in terms of visibility, we felt the frustration of a lot of local partners without the same budget for substantive funding for marketing, basically. So if they were involved in the affected community for years, they wouldn't have the same visibility or name recognition as other more international entities, even though they were and are maybe most directly connected to some of these community needs. And then finally, something that Give to Asia has always prioritized is having donors address the full cycle of disaster relief. So most funding goes to the initial response wave, which is completely understandable, but communities are still feeling the repercussions of a disaster for years, if not decades. Because of that, in Give to Asia disaster campaigns, for a very long time, we've set aside funding for medium to long-term recovery efforts. However, there are a lot of donor restricted funds, and there is a lot of interest in giving to this first cycle. And so with that, I think Sheena's going to talk a little bit about how we decided to address some of these things that we heard.
Thanks, Alex. So yeah, given this context and the challenges that Alex has laid out that we've seen both with donors and nonprofits, we sort of stepped back and saw our role both as an organization that mobilizes philanthropy to Asia on an ongoing basis, but also as an infrastructure builder for the sector to really see where there was opportunity to help build a solution. So DisasterLink has come out of that, and it's basically based on our deep network of nonprofit partnerships in the region, and also this longstanding historical experience that we have in responding to disasters and understanding where resources are needed and when. So what is DisasterLink? So fundamentally, it is a pre-positioned network of disaster response partners in the Asia Pacific region. Now, there's a couple of key principles that have driven the structure of this network. So first, we wanted to make sure that we provided donors with options for partners that have been pre-vetted, both on their experience and reputation, as well as checking all of those boxes on the US regulation side so that donors have options that they feel comfortable with and who are doing good work. We also wanted to make sure that these partners would be ready to respond to any medium or large scale disaster with quick turnaround so that we can rely on them regardless of the type of emergency situation that we were facing. And to facilitate what Alex mentioned, both a lower administrative burden to our partners, but also sort of a streamlined proposal and disbursement process. All of these partners are onboarded as Friends funds with Gift to Asia, which means that they have a pooled fund and a donation platform to allow donations to flow directly to them. And finally, we also wanted to give flexible giving options. And so now donors sort of have multiple ways to give during a disaster outside of just donor advised funds. So you can give to our general disaster campaign, you can select a specific partner within our DisasterLink network and give directly to their Friends funds. So there's now, depending on your appetite for the kind of impact you want to make and the kind of partnership that you want to make, there are more options if you were a donor. But we'll talk through some of this in a bit more detail as we go through the presentation. So in terms of how the network was created, in this first phase of the launch, we've started with 5 countries: Bangladesh, India, Japan, Nepal, and the Philippines. And each of these 5 countries have 4 nonprofit groups in each country. So in total, this first phase has 20 nonprofit partners as part of DisasterLink. And these countries were selected based on 3 initial criteria. First and foremost was looking at their climate risk, and those that have high climate risk and are highly disaster-prone countries in the region were prioritized. Second, we tend to see a higher interest from donors in giving, given their recurring disasters and need for support. And then also we looked at their ranking on the Global Poverty Index, which goes to their increased vulnerability as a country and increased needs as we get into cross-sectoral programming. And then in terms of the 20 partners that make up phase 1, we chose these partners based on some additional criteria. So each organization has the capacity and experience to respond to many phases around the disaster. So not just in the critical relief period, but also in integrated health, water sanitation, livelihood, and risk reduction activities. So they're able to both prioritize that short-term need for immediate aid and then also the long-term recovery. And because many of these groups have been grantees of Gift to Asia, we have this trust-based tested track record with many of these partners. And new partners to our network have also been very familiar to us, and we've worked through partnerships with many of them as well. They're also really well known in their communities, so they know how to navigate those local government requirements, local unique contexts that are heightened in an emergency context. And a big part of our connection to that understanding is our country advisors that we have in every country. And that for us helps to ground that reputational check that they are indeed well positioned in their communities and know their communities well. And also given that, during a critical element of rapid funding is having quick and clear communication. So we know that these are organizations that are able to give us timely updates and clear communication on what's going on, and can update us so that we can send that information to our donors as well. And then just sort of on an administrative level, we want to make sure that these organizations maintain good due diligence status with us before and not when a disaster is striking, so that we don't have to take time on either our side or their side to do that kind of time-consuming compliance step, because we have to do it. We know it's going to come. And so we sort of preempt that by keeping them active in our system. So this is a detailed list of the partners in phase 1. But they are also on our DisasterLink page on our website. And that has an interactive network map where you can click on different countries and click on the organizations and learn a little bit more about the partners. You can also access their direct giving pages. So please, after this presentation, we encourage you to go and check it out and learn a little bit more about our first set of partners. And also just in terms of the overall profile, all of these members have ongoing relationships with our staff and disaster team. So we're constantly in communication with them and we know them well. 90% of them have at least 20 years of experience in disaster risk reduction. And in terms of the sort of footprint that they have, 80% are national level and 20% of them also have sub-regional expertise, because in countries like Nepal and Bangladesh, we have unique climate and disaster contexts that do need a more localized solution when a disaster hits. And this is also sort of echoing our general grant-making approach that is centered on a commitment to localized solutions. But that's sort of, a very broad overview of who's who. And now we're going to go into a little more detail on running an actual disaster campaign in Gift to Asia and how this network is triggered. So I'll hand that over to Alex.
Great. Yeah, we thought it would be helpful to walk through exactly what happens when a disaster hits. So pre-disaster, we may already have an idea that it's coming. We do maintain open lines of communication with all of our DisasterLink partners, and they do notify us of impending storms, rapidly increasing precipitation levels, you name it. And so the moment that a disaster does strike, our partners inform our disaster team and they send us a situation report within 24 hours, which is something that we've discussed in advance. They know exactly what we're looking for, and also they know exactly how to communicate out about their programming and what they seek to do in the coming weeks. With that, our disaster team contacts our in-country presence, because we do have an in-country presence in all of the countries that we have this network in, and they discuss the need for a disaster campaign. With that, the moment that we decide to launch, we will send out an email, and the funding platform is active and ready for donations from the moment that we launch the campaign. And so once it's launched, we basically watch donations come in. We do talk to donors to ensure that if they have an interest in this region, country, theme, you name it, they're aware of this disaster campaign. And also with the programming, as funds reach levels where programming is possible, our disaster team talks to these partners and makes sure that all of the programming is about addressing greatest needs, impact, gaps in funding, maybe that no one else will address. We don't necessarily accept requests for tailored grant making within this pooled fund, just so we can keep it streamlined. And we also, as I previously mentioned, withhold some funds for medium to long-term disaster resilience and recovery. And so while we are continuing to hold this disaster campaign open, we're continuing to fundraise, we're also rapidly programming. We understand that donors want updates. And the way that we've tried to address this is our partners will provide updates on the disaster campaigns and their activities to the disaster campaign page weekly. And then if they are given grants, which they will be, we will basically receive progress reports after the first month, quarter, and year. And this allows them enough time to program so we have results, or at the very least, we have something to report on. But also because it's a pooled fund, they don't necessarily have to go to multiple individual donors to report out, and they're already familiar with the template, which I think is invaluable. And then how do you give? That's an important question. So the first option, as we mentioned, is the disaster campaign. And so we create this pooled fund for each disaster. You can rapidly transfer funding into a disaster campaign the moment it strikes, and we scope and execute those grants according to impact and need, and we allocate funding to medium and long-term priorities. I think you know what the disaster campaign pooled fund looks like at this point, but these other options are also available to you. As Sheena mentioned, each of our disaster partners has a friends fund. And so in this option, we basically made it so if you had a preference as to the partner in country that you wanted to donate to for a disaster, you were able to do that. This is basically a US bank account for that NGO. And so they will, in essence, receive this funding in their US bank account and then request it from us. And that facilitates quick grants directly to one of our partners. All of our DisasterLink partners have this, and we waived the setup fee for them because of our disaster-related programming. Additionally, we also recognize that a lot of donors still do require tailored proposals or advised grant making, and we wanted to provide an option for this and recognize this as a very real part of grant making for disasters. And so you do have the option to create a custom grant to one of our pre-selected partners. So if you want to obtain detailed reporting and tailor a grant in order to obtain or respond to a specific element of the disaster, this might fit your needs a little bit better than these other options. And so once we understand exactly what you want out of this grant, we would facilitate that for you with our disaster team and ongoing giving partners. And finally, this is also a big area, especially for corporations, employee giving. So we work with all major third-party giving platforms, and we place our disaster campaigns as well as our partners' friends funds on the site so employees can give directly to these efforts. Everyone from Benevity, Deed, Bright Funds, upon request, Your Cause, and we often receive matching funds from corporations directly, which complements the employee funds that sometimes come a little bit later if they're from third-party campaigns, which is not necessarily a bad thing because that does complement our giving initiatives, especially with regard to medium and long-term efforts. And then other ways outside of a disaster to support what DisasterLink, we do have two funds outside of discrete disaster events. One is our preparedness fund. And so this, in essence, is supporting Give to Asia in helping our partners fund disaster preparedness for their communities in our network. There's a statistic, I think it's for every $1 spent on disaster preparedness, an average of $6 is saved for response and recovery. That was 1-to-4 ratio in 2013, and it's only grown. And so with that, we do work to increase and strengthen the capacity of civil society and our partners to prepare for the next disaster, which in Asia is more of a when than an if. And so with that, the other fund that we offer is pre-positioned disaster response funds. We do have a general fund at Give to Asia where you can pre-position disaster funds because rapid response is such a challenge sometimes. With this fund, you're able to essentially donate and know that whatever the next large disaster in Asia is, your funds will get there almost immediately. If you would also like to do so with your own donor advised fund, so say, for example, you have a certain amount of money, you're interested in making sure that you can send it out to a disaster wherever you so choose the next time it happens, you can open a donor advised fund with us, park it in there, and then when we inform you of the next disaster, you can say, please send it to X location, which already saves 2 to 3 days given wire times. And so with that, I think in terms of next steps and what we can do with DisasterLink moving forward, Sheena is best placed to talk about this.
Thanks, Alex. So this presentation has been mainly on phase 1 of DisasterLink since it's just launched, and some history there. But there's tremendous opportunity for growth, both of the network itself and in what it can do. So these are a couple places where we already see either movement on growth or places that we would love to have conversations with people who are interested. So first of all, we are going to be expanding this network 5 countries at a time, based on that initial criteria that we shared earlier, tiering by climate risk and those other factors. And we are already working on phase 2. So those new 5 countries that we're looking to scope out partners for are Australia, Indonesia, Pakistan, Timor-Leste, and Vietnam. And the goal is eventually to cover the Asian continent, but we're doing this on sort of a tiered level just to prioritize and to make sure we're being thoughtful about how we're onboarding. And then also we do want to continue to expand the partners who we work with in these countries. So even in our phase 1 partners, as well as what we're building in phase 2 and beyond, we are very interested in hearing from any nonprofits in the region who are deep in this work, who are experts in the field, and who are interested in supporting this from a more programmatic and network member perspective. And finally, we do want to give opportunities to our partners for knowledge sharing. And whether this is through best practices, whether this is just reflections on how a disaster event has gone, we really see the exchange of information between countries who are facing similar disasters in the region to be super valuable. And we've facilitated those kinds of exchanges in the past. But it's important to us because we see our role as also increasing the knowledge base of the sector overall when it comes to disasters in Asia. So this helps to sort of generate new knowledge and insights. And we have in the past built what we've called a community of practice, which is sort of a informal network that has tied together over 150 mostly community-based organizations across disaster vulnerable countries in Asia, that we've been working on and built up over the past several years. But we do want to do more with that network and sort of move it from ad hoc and informal conversations to create more opportunities for these partners to connect, to engage, to visit each other's sites. So there's lots of opportunity there for growth. And all of this takes time, takes resourcing. So if anyone wants to learn more about how to support either the growth of the network itself or get involved in it, we'd love to chat more and for you to reach out to us. So, but that is our formal presentation end. We have had a couple, I think, live questions come through the chat box, but if anybody wants to raise anything in the Q&A box now, I think we'll have a few minutes to address it.
Oh, interesting. I'm seeing one. How much reporting can donors expect when giving to pooled funds? So I think I may have answered this, but just to recap, if you want updates on the situation, those will be updated on the disaster campaign page weekly. If you want updates about what these organizations, these partner organizations are doing with your money, those reports will come after a grant is dispersed to them. They'll come the first month, quarter, and year after the grant is dispersed. I don't necessarily think you want a progress report any sooner than that, because in a week, I'm sure there's a lot you can do, but if the grant, normally our grants have a little bit more substance to them and they're spread out over a slightly longer period of time.
And to add to that, I mean, our US reporting requirement is on an annual basis. So we do collect reports from our partners officially at that time, but sort of to share back with donors, we'll consolidate impact from across the partners that have responded to the disaster and put together sort of a end of disaster campaign report after a year that collates, what the disaster was, who we worked with, what the impact was. And that we usually just post on the fundraising page for that disaster on our website. And so donors can see if they contributed to a pooled fund, they can see the overall impact of that disaster specific pooled fund.
Sheena, that's a great point, because I think it kind of speaks to this tension between, if employees give into this fund, if donors give into this fund, they're passionate about it and they want to see where their funds are going, but they don't necessarily need to see the full impact until the end. So this progress report scenario that we cultivated was sort of a way of addressing both our compliance needs and overall impact analysis with these sort of smaller updates.
Mm-hmm. And I think there was a question that came in about how we decide to work with groups. And a lot of this is based on our country advisors, which are staff and consultants that are based in every country that we operate, as well as our disaster team overall, who knows the sector very well and is connected to many key players. And so presentations like this and other work that we've done in the region have brought different kinds of partnerships to us, either through our staff networks or through key strategic partnerships. So generally, that's how we have at least approached our first round of partners that we've added to DisasterLink. But we certainly are interested, like I mentioned, to hear from others who are doing this work and see how we can engage you.
So I think we have a corporate focused question. I might answer this one, but we use our own so the question is, we use our own platform for employee giving. How does that work with DisasterLink? So I touched on this a little bit, I think, but in essence, it's very common for folks to have an employee giving platform that may have their own time frame for collecting funds. You may even have your own time frame for an employee campaign to begin with and how long you keep it open. That's perfectly fine. We are platform neutral, and quite frankly, I think that wherever we can integrate with a platform to place our disaster campaign funds to catalyze funding in different avenues, that's great. And so with that, what we do normally is we wait for those employee funds to be dispersed to Give to Asia, and then we immediately stick them in the disaster fund to start programming. With that, if the corporate donor wants to offer a match, they can normally do so directly to Give to Asia or go through their platform, whatever is easiest.
There's another live question about how you can connect with our Give to Asia rep to see opportunity for phase 2. So I would encourage anyone who wants to reach out to us to use our info@givettoasia.org email address. And we will route it internally depending on your request or where you come from to make sure it gets the right representative from Give to Asia. Have another question, which is, who is the disaster fund not suitable for? I think, in my opinion, and Alex, feel free to add to it, some of that criteria that we use to select our partners is part of the profile of the types of groups that, is this from a funder's perspective, maybe, not from a partner's perspective? Okay, so then Alex, why don't you take that one? I was reading it as a grantee side.
There are a couple of ways that you could answer this question. So I would love clarification, but if we don't get it, I'm assuming you're talking about the pooled fund structure. So if we're talking about the pooled fund structure, if you as an organization have a very specific giving goal that you want to encounter and you need control over that programming, I think in that case, you can still utilize our network and expertise to conduct that advised grant and sort of help you accomplish your giving strategy. but maybe the pooled fund isn't the best mechanism for you. If we're talking about who is this disaster fund not suitable for from an NGO perspective, then Sheena, maybe you can answer that as well, just to sort of cover both bases.
Yeah, sure. I mean, from that perspective, I think groups that that are not as familiar with disaster programming overall, don't have maybe a long track record of doing that work in their region, or just starting to build that capacity now, I think it would be good for us to keep in touch and to see how you're building your work, and maybe have you join our community of practice so that you can also benefit from the knowledge sharing. But I think we're looking for seasoned organizations who have been doing this work for a long time and who have a good reputation. So if that resonates, I hope it's suitable for whoever is interested. But I think there are other ways, again, to stay connected with the programmatic work that we're doing.
I will also reiterate something that we've mentioned in passing, but maybe want to just sort of underline and clarify, which is that this network is primarily for natural disasters. And so while we used COVID-19 as an example of an emergency situation that we could respond to, another element of who this disaster fund is not suitable for are emergencies that fall out of that natural disaster category.
We have a question on knowledge sharing. So if and how are partners in different countries sharing learnings and supporting each other before and during disasters? How useful is the sharing of resources to address needs around disasters?
Great question.
Yeah, I would say in the cross-country exchange of information and knowledge we've seen happen with, for example, coastal community organization in Philippines coming to Bangladesh to meet a coastal community disaster response group in the Sundarbans coastal region of Bangladesh, knowing that they both face cyclones and typhoons in their respective regions, knowing that they both have big fisher communities that are impacted by that and that impact livelihoods. We actually helped facilitate a sort of what would you call it, like a site exchange, where they physically came to the other's organization to learn about what happens in Bangladesh, for example. And so those are great opportunities for people to see best practices for other countries that face similar ongoing disaster events. There's also, like, people do a lot of case studies reflecting on disasters that have learnings and impact that other countries and other partners can learn from. There's also skill building. So some organizations have groups that have huge capacity building and training programs that they can then share material with other groups. I could go on, but there's tons of opportunities for sharing that kind of knowledge exchange. And I think people are hungry for it. And it's definitely a big need that we've seen.
I'd also just recall that 90% of our partners have over 20 years each in DRR experience. And I just think that depth of knowledge when talking about information and knowledge best practices exchange is invaluable.
We have one that says, does the DisasterLink network also provide capacity building for organizations who are still building their capacity in ER? We want to do this. I think that's part of our growth wish list, is to have more investment that we can then help facilitate to capacity building activities. Because I agree, it's not just for the people who are seasoned in this field, but also for our broader community of practice and other groups that are getting into that space or want to learn from best practices and what's working. So it's not an active part of DisasterLink right now, but it is part of what we want to invest in.
I love this next question. As an individual donor, how can I support DisasterLink to grow and be more sustainable? I think that with our two preparedness is one of those areas where it is very challenging to find donors on a consistent basis, and also can save so many lives in the long run. So with that, you can fund our network of practices ability to prepare their communities if you want to support the growth of DisasterLink directly. All of the areas that Sheena mentioned are highly relevant. And sort of just to go back to that for a second and show you exactly what those areas of growth are. We are working on country expansion. We're growing our network, and this knowledge exchange portion is really valuable. And so what you can do is you can earmark your donation to Give to Asia if you want to remain anonymous, to the DisasterLink network, and we can program it as needs arise. Sheena, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of this infrastructure building work needs a lot of resourcing. So there's the work that any donors can do around a disaster event, and then there's everything to make this network better. And that is where we would love to have conversations with donors. If you have interest in building this infrastructure with us, in helping us reach countries faster. So we've got a slower phased approach, mainly because resourcing constraints. But there are ways for us to build this quicker with the right investment. There are also ways for us to add all kinds of capacity building work that we've talked about already. So there's also very interesting tech solutions and tech platforms that we would also love to build that would make disaster giving just a lot more transparent for the donor in terms of the types of options that you could have, and the different countries that we might be able to provide tax benefit from. So all of that are part of our big wish list.
That may be it for questions.
Mm-hmm.
Sheena, I'll ask you, in building this DisasterLink network out, was there something that struck you as sort of an unexpected joy, or an area of growth or programming that you didn't expect that our partners have really showed up in?
Well, I think it's clear that the need for thoughtful disaster programming is only growing. And so the more thoughtful platforms that I feel like we've built that are trying to fund disasters in the right way, and bringing attention to local organizations who are doing this work and are really doing this on an everyday basis. This isn't just around a disaster event. I think getting that reception and that alignment, that they understand that same need and responsibility as we do, just from different sides of the story. I think that's been really rewarding, and it's why we want more countries to be part of this, and to see how we can be working together better. So I think we went into it being like, this would be a good idea. We have the track record, we could do it, but is it going to work? Are we going to get the right partners? And I've been very happy to hear kind of the reception on the program side.
Yeah, I've been blown away by the level of partnership between the organizations that we have in our network and our team. And so with that, if you do have any questions for us, I'm just going to go back to our final slide. Please feel free to reach out to us at info@givetoasia.org.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.